right, good day, everybody. Want to welcome you to our first edition of our new podcast for DR McNatty. This is DRM Unfiltered, the podcast that dares you to go beyond the buzzwords. Get ready. We're going to hold some bold conversations with our experts, our clients, and our industry leaders to talk about transforming capital project delivery. We're going to talk about real world Primavera breakthroughs to game changing strategies, success stories, and we'll be serving unfiltered insights that fuel innovation and inspire the future of project controls. Our motto is no fluff, no filters, just the voices shaping tomorrow. I'd like to introduce our guest today, Garrett Harley. Garrett, go ahead and introduce yourself, give a little bit of background on you.
Sure. Hey, good to see you again, brother. So Garrett Harley, I work in our product marketing organization for Oracle Primavera. I work in our construction engineering business. I've been a Primavera user since I started at Bechtel a little over 26, 27 years ago. So a long-term project controls guy, made the acquisition into Primavera's business, that acquisition into Oracle's business. And great to be with you. It's going to be a fun topic today.
So you're the OG of OGs we got, right?
I don't know about that, but yeah, I've certainly been around the block here.
Perfect. All right. So our topic of today, it's going to be called Primavera Face-Off, Oracle Primavera Cloud, or as you know, we love acronyms in this business, OPC or P6 EPPM. Which is the right one? And kind of a little emphasis statement. We're going to dive into, I'm going to call it one of the more pressing debates in project controls. OPC versus P6 EPPM. Which platform truly delivers the edge for our client organizations or, the projects that we work on. This face-off, it's not about theory, it's about practical insights, lessons learned, the realities of implementation. We'll explore how each tool stacks up in integration, scalability, performance. We're going to hear from our OG Oracle expert today, who's basically lived this journey from, soup to nuts. I mean, you probably go all the way back to P3 shirt track days and
I
beyond.
do.
You've seen the evolution of these softwares. By the end of this conversation, our hope is that the audience will walk away with an unfiltered perspective to help you decide which solution is the right fit for your organization or your capital programs. So, thanks for joining us today. We're going to kind of jump right into this real quick. So, where I want to start with this is, can you maybe give a brief explanation of what OPC or Oracle Primavera Cloud and P6 EPPM are and how they differ in their core architecture?
Sure. Well, it's a great topic, right? I just think of this as an uptown problem, right? So they're both great solutions. And it's probably interesting to at least make sure that we haven't known that for those folks out there that have been longtime P6 users and love that tool, that it's not going anywhere. P6 isn't going anywhere. We have no plans on having P6 walk away. So that's great news for a lot of customers that I think, might be in a position where there's a lot of comfort, there's a lot of adoption, there's a lot of trust in that application and what it lets them do, irrespective of whatever type of capital improvement program they're running. And if you're happy in it, we're happy you're happy in it. There's no need to think about, what do you want to do next? But the interesting part about what we've done with Oracle Primavera Cloud is we've taken a lot of the legacy intellectual property of all the things that are great about P6. And when we're talking about where the future of project controls might be able to go, we really wanted to think about, we've made certain acquisitions kind of over that amount of time. I mean, you'll remember having gone through this with me, that as the Primavera business evolved, we looked at other ways that we could extend the value of what we did around planning and scheduling. And we added in things like, the acquisition of risk, which is a huge part of every project and a really important topic for any capital improvement project. So we had certain acquisitions over time, over the last, say, 3 or 4 decades. And what our goal was to try and look at that architecture that you were just talking about. And instead of having multiple applications service those use cases, whether that use case was around the core planning and scheduling or resource management or risk management, or if you're an owner, maybe even portfolio management and capital planning. And how could we take all of those capabilities and put them into one container that lets you do everything? So that was the premise behind OPC as a thesis. And when we were architecting that development process, which started many years ago, it was to try and take not just the core of what P6 was good at and is good at, but add to it. What are ways that we could add more value in that one box? So when I think about OPC, OPC is, essentially 4 decades worth of intellectual capital and all the ways that those customers have benefited from using Primavera legacy tools and trying to put all that capability into one container that you could deploy, irrespective of whether or not the capital improvement program dealt with commercial construction or infrastructure or industrial work. But back to your original point, P6 has a very loyal following on our infrastructure business, our commercial business, and our industrial business. And we have customers, owners, and contractors that use those tools extensively every day. So to me, it's more of what are sort of the questions that are important for you to ask and answer now, and then what are the directions that you really want to take the business in the future? And for some folks, that might be what we have around planning and scheduling in our core, and what we execute today with P6 services the need, and that's great. But in the future, if there were advancements that were interesting to you on being able to extend the value of what P6 is doing now, you can take advantage of elements of Oracle Primavera Cloud now with running your scheduling practice in P6 and then taking advantage of the risk management that's available in OPC. Or maybe it's taking advantage of the task management and the field production and lean construction, means and methods that we've also now baked into OPC. Or maybe it's the portfolio management and capital planning that we've also baked into OPC. So it doesn't have to be a shift everything at one time discussion, which I think is a concern for a lot of people. It can be a gradual thing that can happen over time. But I'll tell you, candidly, in our mid-market practice, it's probably the fastest growing, series of customer base in our business today. So you could think of that as kind of companies that are in a revenue stream of maybe 50 million to 250 million. And they're really looking at that cloud adoption move. And where would the future of their business ideally want to go? How do we include more folks into that planning and scheduling core? Make that collaboration experience on schedule development, more unified? How do I connect an office and a field team, let's say? And the options that are available inside something like Oracle Primavera Cloud and the capabilities that it has are just very different than the ways that you and I, were originally introduced to something like P6, which is really great for what I'll just sort of say is, a seasoned or tends to be more seasoned planner and scheduler. That tool has an amazingly rich series of capabilities. But what's tough about it is handing that tool off to, say, an inexperienced user, a beginner, and then wanting them to be productive as early as we possibly can. The exciting part to me, anyway, as someone that's lived through all the different iterations of what we've built here at Oracle, is Oracle Primavera Cloud is a great experience for folks that are on the end side of that expert curve, but it's also great for folks that are on the beginning side of getting into planning and scheduling. And they can mature their capabilities and sort of turn more on, unlock more stuff as they, want to advance their career. So it's great. They can handle the small project world as well as the big project world. And that's sort of a unique thing about what OPC is engineered and architected to do.
That's great. And you mentioned something, and I don't know if a lot of people really realize this, that a lot of the architecture of OPC was built off of P6. And that kind of leads to a two-part question. How would you compare the scheduling and resource management capabilities of those two tools, seeing that it is built upon that architecture? And then I'll come back with the second part of that question.
Sure. Maybe I'll clarify that just a little bit. The DNA, the algorithms, the ways that folks have gotten so trusted on the outcomes of what we do inside P6, where you trust the data set, You believe exactly what we're telling you whenever you put these things in, right? That we have calculations and algorithms that run according to how your critical path method is done. Like we are the standard in that market for a reason. And that same DNA is what is inside OPC. So as far as the calcs and how things run, they're identical. They're identical,
That's
which is great, right?
that's
So,
fantastic.
but on the architecture side, on the architecture of where the underlying data model is and the types of things that we capture inside P6 versus OPC, it's obviously much bigger in Oracle Primavera Cloud than it is in P6. For some of the things, for some of the reasons why I just mentioned, if I'm an owner and I'm interested in doing something like capital planning and understanding what are the right projects to even do, that whole module is available inside OPC as well as planning and scheduling. For the folks that are, say newer to engineering and construction and want to get involved in that sort of unified plan of connecting the field team and the office team, and if that experience today is happening even on a trailer and on a card wall with post-it notes, that whole thing could be digitized and put inside task management within OPC today, which is also a huge growth area for us, just because it's a lighter weight experience.
And that leads to kind of the second part of my question, and I'm going to talk about this from personal experience, where you mentioned having risk embedded into Oracle Primavera Cloud, where, a decade ago, I was working on a $10 billion LNG facility. We did all of our scheduling in P6, and when we had to do our risk analysis, the client I was working for had three different risk softwares. They had Primavera Risk Analysis, Acumen Risk, and Palisade at Risk. So you had three different practitioners that you would have to bring your file out to take it into those softwares. And I try stressing this when talking to people that if you're doing risk, this tool has it built right in. So you're doing your scheduling and your risk side by side instead of going out to another platform to do your analysis to bring that file back in.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned this because to me, this is one of the more exciting parts of what we're doing in the architecture today, as well as the application set. So absolutely right. I think most folks that have looked at the Primavera brand over the last 3 to 4 decades, the risk modules of what we used to, deploy had a lot more to do with the analytics. Folks that were interested in doing Monte Carlo analysis, folks that are interested in running, the full probabilities of exactly how those schedule outcomes on both schedule and cost, we're going to land. We certainly use those things at Bechtel, right? We had a completely different, set of risk, tools that we went through to use, but you eventually, what you'd like to do is be able to tie those things to the schedule, and then you get all these quantitative analytics things. What I find most exciting about what we do in OPC now, and if you just think about it from the communities that used to be involved in, I just think of it almost like the licensing kind of count. Irrespective of whoever I was talking to, whether this is owners or contractors, I might have a certain community that's involved in planning and scheduling, and then I had a different group that was involved in the risk analysis portion. And you could almost think of those ratios as like a 10 to 1. For the 10 people that I might have involved in my core planning and scheduling practice, I might have one or two that are helping me with the risk analysis part. Where we've flipped the script is our risk management isn't just about the analytics anymore. Risk management is a comprehensive risk management tool that we've built inside OPC. And the more interesting target to me with many customers and prospects is Excel, where the log associated with risk events, how we even identify risks, who can identify risks, tends to go into a spreadsheet for a lot of companies. It's not a bad thing. But the problem we eventually run into is if I have a log that's being managed in Excel, I eventually want to tie those things, ideally into elements of the schedule. If I'm interested in doing the analytics part, like that's the requirement. But what if we could put all that stuff into one place? So you could identify risks irrespective of where you are. You could quantify those risks with a qualitative analysis and score it quickly. You could then go through a quantitative analysis, which is the part we've always been known for, and we're great at. We can do the quantitative part, all the Monte Carlo simulations, all the charts and graphs, all the probability distribution graphs, all that stuff. It's all there. as well as all the monitoring and response plans that you want to have that typically are tied back to the log. So there's usually, you could think of it kind of like PMI has a risk management, a 6-step risk management framework that is a best practice framework, irrespective of what tool you might want to use. It is a recommendation based upon an industry best practice. We have basically taken that risk management framework from PMI and we have baked it into OPC. What I find fascinating now is we have several customers that have moved 5 of those steps out of Excel and are now managing those things inside OPC. The quantitative part, interestingly enough, for most organizations isn't even required, right? You don't have to do quantitative analysis. It's there if you want to do it. But for a lot of people, it might be just as easy to be able to say, how do I just get out of Excel and get the log into some place where, you know, I can hit it irrespective of wherever I am.
Mhm.
So that's been fun because the numbers have switched a little bit based upon where the value for the community on the job site is. So where in the past we might have had, that community of maybe 10 to 15, folks that are managing the project and planning schedule for a project. Now we can think about the risk, identification step as being, well, how many people are on a job site? And maybe that's 100 people or it's 200 people. And truthfully, I think if you're on a job site, the whole way that you get risk management to become, viral is if you see something, say something. Where does it go? How does it ultimately get identified? How do you eventually start quantifying it? How do you track it? If you want to do the qualitative and quantitative part, great. How hard is it to tie it to the schedule? All of that stuff is built inside OPC. So I've got examples of customers that might still have that same planning and scheduling core practice in P6. That's what I mean by the extension. I can extend the value of that P6 investment and take advantage of modules inside OPC that I may not have known about today. So I have some that are still managing that planning and scheduling core inside P6, but are using, risk for those Excel-based processes. And there's 300 people in it while there's still 15 to 20 schedulers. Like that to me is exciting because it's a way of being able to look at that data set, know that eventually you want to be able to tie it into your scheduling practice, and it's just built in the same house. It's not hard to do.
Yeah, and I think that kind of takes on another flavor of you mentioned Excel and people doing their own types of process or taking it out to another tool that you eliminate the options of, I don't want to call it human error, but with Excel, you do have human error where you may change a formula, not even knowing that you did it with having everything all in one system and the settings that you have in, third-party systems that are out there. I think you remove those issues or potential errors that you could run into.
It can be worse than that, right? Just to the same point you described is you might have a cell that is an integer value and you could have another cell that's a text value. And if you're looking for it to sum, it doesn't know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
So that math is never an issue with us. Like we know where it's supposed to go. We know what those integers mean. We know how to roll them up. We know how to calculate them, right? So I just think the flexibility is really fun when you really talk about whether or not, that whole discussion of what is the right answer for me based upon where I'm currently at. And I think this is really unique and valuable to any given customer. There's options. You don't have to think about your P6 practice completely going away. It could stay exactly where it is, but you could extend the value of it with taking advantage of modules inside OPC because they are engineered to work together. And over time, and this is the other fun part, over time, you can gradually transition that planning and scheduling core from P6 into OPC if you want to, right? We have a full migration path available. There's ways to be able to lift and shift the data. We don't have to worry about how the calculations run because it, again, shares the same DNA. We have built these things to work side by side for a reason.
Yeah, and that's a great lead into, my next question is, and this is what I found, and I've been working in OPC since it was Prime. I don't want to age myself a little bit, but you start talking about, migration and integration capabilities, And you don't have to say it's one or the other because you can work with them side by side. And we have a couple of organizations that we work with that has OPC on one side of the house, P6 on the other side, and you can integrate them to talk to each other. And I find that fascinating that one side of the house works in P6, one side works in OPC. You see the same projects, same data peer set up. And I find that very, very interesting where you don't have that with other programs. And maybe you can kind of expand on that a little bit.
I think the reality of it is is what does the contract say? So a lot of government contracts, and this is has been a great problem to have as a in the Primavera business, is that a lot of government contracts still specify that P6 needs to be the format. But the contracting side, interestingly enough, that has wanted to say, look at some of these capabilities inside OPC and have made these decisions to just go all in, that still want to be in compliance with the contract, can still export information out as a P6 format to be able to be in compliance with the contract. I think for a lot of folks, that is just the truth, right? The truth is that is the reality until governments begin to go through and modify their specifications over time. And that does take time, right? So it's not a force fit for you to have to say, well, I'm working with X type of owner. I've landed a government contract for state or federal. And how do I stay in compliance with the contract? The truth of the matter is you could be in either system and be in compliance. So that's great news. And that's been an interesting way that you've seen a lot more of the delivery team side of the house, general contractors, subcontractors that have been excited about some of the things that OPC can help them do long term and make collaborative planning more of a reality in what they want. Or it's just that P6 might have just been too heavy, an experience for them to get in and get started. So OPC was attractive that way. It was just easier to be able to, deploy and pick up. But if they still had to submit information to their owner or their customer, that they could still be in compliance with whatever the contract might say as far as the spec was concerned. So I think over time, that same thing was true even with P3 moving into P6, which I know you remember too, right? Which is the same. Well, wait a minute. When do I make this transition? When do I make this move? Why would I make this move? If I have contracts that are still specifying that I have to use some older version of Primavera, how's that going to work if I want to move into this other paradigm? We've thought a lot about that, and we've tried to make it easy for folks to think about that transition whenever it makes sense for them to make that transition. But you can still be in compliance because again, these two systems are engineered to spend, to share the data together, which is great. So hopefully, again, it's one of those things that owners over time, will also want to see the value of moving their practices into OPC. We've seen a lot of interesting movement in the market with large owners that are beginning to change those specs, which downstream does drive a lot of delivery team, general contractor, subcontractor behavior. But if you're a contractor and you are excited about where OPC might be able to take you, the good news is you could start now. You could just get in. You could get going with it, and you could still be in compliance with contracts that are still specifying P6.
Yeah,
So
our client, their roadmap for this, and they've been a long time P6 user, everything's written into their specifications for P6. Where OPC found a fit for them was in their pre-planning division. They create your initial schedules in pre-planning, but also their risk division is using OPC too. It's a small handful of people, maybe 10 to 12 people that are using it for the pre-planning and the risk, while your heavy duty users, I think they have about 600 users, is using P6 on a regular day in and day out basis. But being able to have the two programs talk to each other and integrate through the path that's built into both of them works for that organization so well because you can do everything in one for the heavy duty day in and day out to your pre-planning and your risk in another platform and still see all the results that they need to see without having disparate systems.
yeah, the great thing about truthfully, the great thing about P6 and OPC is when you talk about trying to share the information, share the data back and forth across boundaries or parties, how it gets deployed, the system doesn't really care, right? It could be a transition of sending file, infrastructure back and forth because the formats know how to accept each other. But we have some progressive owners that also deploy it a different way and say, we want to own the sandbox.
Mhm.
And we're going to invite our contractors in to play in that environment with the tools that we provide. And again, it's right back to the way that a lot of contracts might get set up. In some cases, progressive owners might say, look, you're going to wrap up the cost of the software procurement on your side in my fee anyway, somewhere. So I might as well just own the environment and have you come in and play with it. Or the spec is written out in such a way that they say, just send me the information in the format that I'm willing to accept. The system doesn't care, right? The system doesn't care. But it is a foundational difference in how you look at your process of where you want planning and scheduling to improve and why you want it to improve. For the progressive owner out there that says, I want to procure the sandbox and have those delivery teams come in and play with the tools the way that I've, set them up for you, it's magical because you're never importing or exporting anything.
True. Very
So even though, we always talk about import and export routines as being one of those things that can be risky or some people perceive as risky when you're sending information back and forth, across parties. As confident as I am that we're pretty good about being able to send that information back and forth, the truth of the matter is, it could be just as easy in a lot of cases, especially in cloud environments where you could have everybody go in there and play in the exact same system at the same time without ever importing and exporting anything. That's a very different way to run the company.
Exactly. And kind of step back or two steps back, and you mentioned this kind of in your opening. And I know you guys won't give out the secret sauce or the KFC recipe because you don't like to talk about future roadmap, but this is kind of along the lines of you mentioned that P6 is not going anywhere. There's still a lot of investment in it. And where do you see Oracle investing? Is it going to be both in OPC and P6, or do you think it's going to be one or the other?
Yeah, so we invest heavily in both. I'll make that crystal clear. But with how mature our P6 product line is, we do major releases on that platform twice a year. So it's a little different for Oracle Primavera Cloud for OPC because as a full SaaS native cloud product, we release software on that platform every month. So they're just different types of investment as far as where the dev team is working. So we're still actively investing in both platforms, but the frequency of where customers gain value happens every month in OPC, and it happens twice a year for P6.
Well, I
So, and
know.
part of it is just because of the feature sets of what those systems do, right? So,
I was going to say, I know from sitting in a bunch of meetings that back in the day, I'm going to say the infancy of P6, everybody wanted it to look and feel like P3. So the wish list to Primavera and Oracle was always very long. Obviously, that wish list is probably a little bit shorter now because that tool has come a long way since, we'll say version 5 or version 6, whichever one you want to talk about as the beginning of P6, to where OPC has evolved quite a bit from, say, Prime to where it is now, and it still has a longer wish list. The wish list now is probably like when P6 first came out, where P6's wish list is a little bit shorter now.
that's fair. I think this is a fair criticism for customers that are really used to being in one environment and obviously know how that store is laid out and get a lot of comfort in being able to walk in and out of that store knowing exactly where everything is and how to be efficient in it, right? When you're switching stores, I think the struggle that most folks have isn't necessarily on pure capability. A lot of it has to do with the fact that you've just got to rebuild a new mental map.
Mhm.
So I like to say that, the parity list of the things that we've worked down of elements of P6 that folks really wanted inside OPC, the list on that parity comparison between the two is pretty small now. It is a fair, assessment that if you would wind that clock back 5 years ago, we had a long way to go. But we have worked really hard on closing those gaps and prioritizing, how to close those gaps with features that people really, really, needed and wanted and used every day. And it has less to do now with whether or not there's milk in one store and milk in the other store, because they both have it. And it has more to do with, well, I'm used to being able to get in and out of the store, navigating it and know exactly how that works. And when I transition into a new store, I've got to learn the new layout, right? I got to learn, where things are now. We still have milk in the store, but it's not on aisle 2, it's in aisle 4. So it's not the stuff that's inside. It tends to be the time that it takes anyone to go through the new navigation because the UI is different. And I've had to go through that transition twice now, right? So did it when it was P3 moving into P6, did it when it was P6 moving into OPC. I know how to go in and out of any of those stores now. I know where everything is. I'm efficient no matter what tool I'm in. But it does there that is a real transition that customers do struggle with. It's one of the reasons why, the work that you guys do is so important too as an implementation partner, right? That it's great to have helping hands. As intuitive as the UI can be, it's always nice to be able to have someone there that you can always just pick up the phone and and have on site or call or whatever. Hey, I'm in the store now. I'm looking for milk. Can you just remind me where it is? So it's it's the stuff that people are going through to do is not contextually all that different. But there is a lot more things in our OPC store than are available inside of our P6 store. So, if you're interested in things like task management, that's a whole new thing to learn. If you're interested in being able to do your capital planning, process inside OPC, that is a whole new thing to learn. If you're interested in taking advantage of the risk management components that we just talked about, that can be an entirely new thing to learn. So it's exciting to me that we can have all those experiences and have all that learning, be able to help bridge the gap between those two. Also understanding that the underlying DNA between those two platforms and the parity that you just described is something that is, it's a lot more minimal now than it was 5 years ago. We've got a lot of customers that have gone through that wall and made that full transition from one store to the other. And like anything, once you know your way around, you know, you don't want to go back. Um, but it takes time, right? There's a real part of any transition, irrespective of whatever software platform you're talking about.
That's a great analogy. I'm gonna have to remember that one. Um, Moving on, and this is a question that I get a lot in a lot of the discussions I have with our clients and potential clients is I know what mine would be, and I kind of want to ask you, what do you think are the top three factors a company should consider when choosing between OPC and P6?
That's fair. So for our legacy P6 customer base, I think the place where that tool excels is in kind of the large project world. If it is a if it is a big, hard, complex program or project, and it has a lot of requirements around things like advanced resource management, um, that tool is amazing at that. It is absolutely the 900-pound gorilla when you start talking about, jobs like our oil and gas or, industrial customer base that do a lot of resource management, a lot of resource loading for shutdowns, turnarounds, and outage businesses. There's a lot of those projects, are massive. Lots of activities, lots of coordination events, and for some folks, that's just it becomes a requirement of you'll rip this thing out of my, cold dead hand. And that's great. Like that's okay. I think most folks might be surprised at how far we've taken the resource management and advanced resource management work and the same DNA and moved that into OPC. And it can handle large projects as well as it can handle small projects. But to me, there's also other things that can be included in those experiences like latencies, because being on an on-premise, platform can be different than being, on a cloud platform. We do a lot of work in being able to continually improve our performance testing to make the experience of being on a cloud product just as fast and nimble as being on an on-premise product. But depending upon the size of those data sets, that's a real thing. So to me, it's more about it tends to focus more on market and like what you're making. Like what is the asset? What's the thing that's being built? And in our industrial segment, for things like oil and gas, petrochemical, nuclear, all of our DOE and DoD customers, a lot of folks still love, the experience of P6. But the interesting part is we've made a lot of headway in having that same performance and the data set sizing inside OPC be just as responsive as it is in P6. and it's going to continue to improve, right? We're going to continue to make those things better. Oracle infrastructure and the tech stack available with this stuff is, it's second to none. I think we are the only major construction engineering dedicated hyperscaler on the planet when you really, talk about it that way. So the other exciting part is, I think you and I have both tended to see I might have written a prescription if I like walked into yours, if you were the doctor's office, you might have walked into my office and said, all I do is manage large, complex projects. And I might have originally written you a P6 subscription in the past. And if you had small, simple projects, you might have decided you wanted to use something else, like a Microsoft project or other. And you just said, they're different. I don't need, a hammer to hit this nail. It's a small project. I could use something else for small projects. To me, the really interesting thing that's happened in looking at OPC is we've had a lot more small project work and the simple, project work as a replacement for folks that might have been using something like our Microsoft in the past. That experience looks and feels a lot like what they're used to. And it's also great at handling small jobs. The bigger picture for me anyway is the excitement that comes into the aha moment, which is true for almost every customer that you and I have ever walked into, which is at some point in time, someone will walk into your office and say, hey, I'm managing all the small work over here and I'm managing all the big work over here. They're in different systems. What if I eventually want everything together? How do I do that? And that even in the P6 world was not always an easy answer. I wasn't going to tend to put P6 in the hands of a beginner for a good reason, right? It's a very sophisticated, rich feature set tool. It's awesome. But for beginners, it can be a tough learning curve. Well, now we've got an experience where if you're a beginner, I can get you into OPC and you can be comfortable, like day one. But if you're an expert, I can also get you into that experience. And for the things that you would expect it to be able to do, things like advanced resource management, earned value management, risk management, portfolio management, capital planning, ways that you can include that collaboration with your field teams for task management and unifying that within your CPM schedule without ever having to leave the house. Like that is a completely different series of discussions. And it also talks about sort of this maturity curve of where users, I think, sort of sit. Ideally, what I would really want, and this is exactly why we're building the way we are, and why this is our thesis, years ago and what we wanted to get right, is if planning and scheduling didn't become a more collaborative process where I could include folks that were on the newer side versus the expert side, I needed to get all those folks into the same system eventually.
Mhm.
And that was the goal. That still is the goal. How do I have an experience that's great for beginners and great for experts? How do I handle, small, simple projects and large, complex projects? And knowing that eventually where every organization I've ever worked with gets to is I want my hands around all of it eventually. It may not be tomorrow. It may not be 2 months from now, but eventually someone says, all projects matter. I need to be able to see all my projects. All the users matter. I need something that can handle beginners and experts. Where should I go? And in the past, I think that was a reality check of organizations had to make a series of different decisions that ultimately led to technology investments that weren't the same. And that's okay. But if you could create an experience and build an environment and have an architecture that did satisfy small, simple projects, large, complex projects, beginners and experts, and stick them all in one place that they never had to leave, and that they would all be happy. Like that should be what we want as a platform.
It's good that you mentioned about the hyperscaling because in the infancy days of OPC in the prime days, I always keep a project, and this is something one of my mentors taught me. He goes, find a good project, and whenever a new product comes out, bring that project into it and see if you can break it. And that LNG project was 50,000 activities, fully cost loaded, fully resource loaded, and I broke it.
Yeah, early days of OPC, yeah, not made for that, right? There was a lot of performance testing work and all the stuff that just handles on the volume side, right? Latency is a real thing.
Yes.
Making that experience a real thing. And like I said, that's where the great news is like P6 isn't going anywhere. And if those programs, and we still have lots of customers that are doing these major long-term programs, P6 is a great vehicle for it. That's fantastic. Stay there. Keep keep using it. It's exactly what it's made for. So, but that is the kind of future aha moment is when those latency components and the sizes of those data sets and all that stuff becomes something that is almost indistinguishable. Now you got something to think about, right? Uh, and it's a good problem to have, right? I we are a 4-decade business.
I
It
mean,
is
obviously a
it
topic
is it
for,
is difficult to think through like how do you stay at the forefront and still be innovative and still move with what these trends in technology have done and take advantage of all that work. That is a huge advantage being here at Oracle. A massive advantage being here at Oracle is that we can put a lot of that tech stack to work and it continues to get better every day.
yeah, and obviously topic for another time, another day. You mentioned, latency and how that comes into play, and maybe we'll hit on that in a future session. But in P6, you look at how that's run on a database level, how you can max a database out, where in OPC you have your workspaces and being in the cloud. Obviously, that is tuned to how you are utilizing your data in there. But again, topic for a whole different topic for a whole nother day, but it's something.
Completely different architecture. Yeah, completely different architecture. And that's I'm glad you mentioned it because we workspaces were a really challenging concept on the architecture early on, but it was one of those things that was really important to us to get right, since it also is a different way of thinking about security, thinking about ways that go through and access different data sets depending upon who you are. Because there's lots of different personas that are involved in projects. So some folks want to be able to see everything. Some folks just only need to be able to see this project. How
Mhm.
do you create an experience in a security model that actually lets everybody do the same, do what they need to do? Um, it was a little harder to handle some of those security requirements inside something like P6, just based upon how we set up the database. But workspaces I mean, it's a total game changer, right? I mean, it's a completely different model.
The only reason I brought it up is usually when we talk about factors in deciding, that's one of the factors that I talk about. Division A wants their own database, Division B wants their own database. So while your data is in the same system, it's kind of segregated, where in a workspace, you are technically kind of segregated, but you can still roll it up instead of having to log out, log back into another database to do your reporting at. And that's
Well, and the security, I mean, the security model we had inside P6. I mean, I used to recommend as an implementer when I would go out and start helping companies, like deploy this kind of stuff, you would create an enterprise project structure in the EPS inside P6, and you would almost create a mimic of that in your organizational breakdown structure in your OBS, because that's part of what tied your security profiles together. So that same concept inside OPC got completely blown apart. And the reason why we did it that way is because that's the way that you almost had to set it up in P6 for it to work,
Mhm.
is you needed a mirror image of your EPS structures and your OBS structures to be able to create the security models to allow access down to the levels that you wanted. With workspaces, exactly like you described, you used to have to come up with a whole other concept of how many databases you needed to run. That can turn into a hot mess. And 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 unfortunately, like we let it happen sort of that way. And a lot of organizations did create completely new databases to be able to quarantine, what really should have just been a security profile.
Correct.
So now with workspaces, you're all still in one database, but now you've got a way to partition users down to just a finer set of information that they need, groups of projects together, right? Or a line of business or a department or whatever it is. And a very different way to be able to approach, how we built the security model, and why the security model in a different framework became more flexible. So the whole intent was to try and make it more flexible so that as you looked at workspaces and trying to quarantine where you wanted data to be and how you wanted your access controls to work and how you wanted to get people involved in the planning and the execution components, like all of that was just way more configurable than what we ever did in P6.
You hit the nail right on the head with that. So, we'll start wrapping things up. And, kind of my last thought to you is, do you have any final advice for whether it's project managers, organizations, clients that are looking into navigating this type of decision?
So I'll go back a little bit to what I said in the beginning is they're both great tools. and neither one of them are going anywhere. Certainly, as far as the investment side of where we're continuing to put, capital and horsepower behind our development teams, we extend it to both platforms. But the frontier of where a lot of the exciting stuff is happening is going to be on Oracle Primavera Cloud, right? All of our investments in AI are going to be going towards OPC, or not all of them, but a lot of them. Majority of them are going towards OPC. Plus, we've got all these additional modules of components that we just described together, right? So taking advantage of task management and lean construction, means and methods, taking advantage of, portfolio management and capital planning, taking advantage of all the risk framework that we've baked into that. But here's the good news. The good news is it doesn't have to be a one or the other debate. You could still keep your P6 practice and your planning and scheduling core there, and you can extend it with capabilities inside OPC because they are engineered to work together. So if that is interesting, meaning you've got a planning and scheduling core in P6 and you want to take advantage of risk, or you want to take advantage of tasks, or you want to take advantage of portfolios and capital planning, you can do it. Uh, and I think that is the truth of where a lot of folks think about this sort of transition over time is where can I extend that investment where it makes sense or where they want to see that value. And at a point in time where maybe taking that same planning and scheduling core that's in P6, if suddenly there's a moment where you say, geez, it seems silly that I'm doing the planning and scheduling core over here and then I'm using these additional extensions. What if I could do those same things? If all those same capabilities existed over in OPC, I can still get milk over there. Why wouldn't I think about just going all in? So it's completely customer specific in my view. Everybody has a different prescription that ultimately needs to get considered and written, but we don't do that in a vacuum. I think we understand that everyone is actually a snowflake and that it's different. So what the right answer is really depends upon doing an assessment, right? And like what's important to you? What do you want to see get improved? What about your current planning and scheduling process is painful? What about your current planning and scheduling process do you feel is missing? If you wanted it to be more collaborative, how could we help you change that? What are some of those processes that we would want to dive in on? And then also understanding the current feature sets of the things that you're taking advantage of in P6. Like we do an assessment process that basically just outlines and logs all of that. Like here are all the things that we usually use on a configuration. This is what the entire P6 configuration contains. And we help you map it. So, all right, this is exactly what it's going to look like when you're in the new store. Here are the things that are going to be there. This is exactly how it's supposed to work. We'll teach you exactly how to go from aisle 1 to aisle 4. So some of it is just the mental mapping component, which is also part of any, successful implementation. But what that answer really means, it can vary. I would never sit here and say, you should just pick up everything you're doing right now and think about doing it in a completely different store. Not everyone's ready to do that. Is it great? Yeah, I can tell you the new store is rad and it has a lot of great stuff in it. And there's these whole other, wings of it that we're never going to be able to put into P6. And that's part of why we built something new was because we had a lot more options in how we wanted to configure it, how we wanted to make it more collaborative, how we wanted to invite more people in, how we wanted to give you more value in one box. All of that stuff was the intent. Are we sitting on our laurels and standing still? No. We are investing heavily in making everything we do, get better every day. But the value that most folks, continue to experience on something like an OPC where you're on a native SaaS product and you want a cloud environment, um, it's a different animal. It's a different animal. There's a lot of stuff in there that is really exciting. There's a whole bunch of fun features, and we could talk more about the stuff on the roadmap in other sessions. Of things that we don't tend to talk too much about parts for futures, but I can give you anecdotal evidence of sort of where we're going. Uh, it's it's fun. It's part of why I've stuck around here so long is because I still don't feel like we've finished making this what it really needs to be. But being able to take 4 decades full of intellectual capital and all these best practices for us as builders, right? like most of us that are working on our development and our production teams, came from the industry and we know what those industries want and ask for. And, we continue to invest in all that stuff to be able to make it better. In addition to, all the folks that are out there doing this implementation and services work, like what Dear McNatty does. So all that feedback is important, and it all needs to go into a place where we prioritize that and incrementally make this stuff better. But if you haven't seen OPC, go check it out. Call up call up Dear McNatty and go look at it. It's pretty cool. Um, but there's 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 no point in having to think about making those transitions, right away if it's working right now. There's nothing wrong with P6 is doing its thing and it's working great. We are more than happy to have you there and are grateful for it. So whenever it makes sense, right? I think that's the thing that needs to be unique to every single customer. Whatever those components are, and either extending the value or if it made sense to be able to think about, looking at that planning and scheduling core, and if you could do the same things and if you could get the same outcomes, and we could put you on an infrastructure that was cheaper, and more value inside it and better ROI, something to think about. But whenever it's the right time.
Yeah, a lot of the points that you made today are excellent because a lot of the points that you have stated go into that type of needs assessment when I sit down with an organization for the first time and we have this discussion. What are your needs? What are your requirements? And that's really where you start the basis of making the deciding factor. I want obviously what's best for our client to make them sufficient in what they need to do. So, I really appreciate the time today. And for our audience that's going to be joining us, stay tuned. Garrett and I are going to be having a few more sessions where we may hit on a little bit more taboo topics about OPC, but we're not going to let the cat out of the bag. We'll let you guys figure that out when you join us for our next one. Garrett, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate the time and the answers that you were able to provide to everyone as a whole.
Dan, it's always good to see you, buddy, and look forward to the next one. We'll have some fun.
All right, take care. We'll talk soon.
All right.